All right, whenever you're ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All righty. Welcome back to Career Coaching X's and O's, and today we have a terrific show for you today. One of Atlanta's preeminent voices, if not the Southeast, is here with us to talk about her career, her journey, and give you some tips on ways that you can start out from point A, which is undergrad, life, and make it to the very top, because she's at the very top of her profession. And I'm talking about Miss Jovita-Moore. Miss Moore, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for taking time to talk with me.
Absolutely. So before we jump in and learn more about your career, tell us a little bit about you and your journey.
Well, let's see, I was born and raised in New York City. I think a lot of people don't know that. They think I'm from the South.
I thought so.
Right.
When I ran into you, I thought
Right.
you were from the South.
Exactly. So born and raised in New York City, grew up with a single mom and went to New York City public schools. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, and she was the keeper of the television, which was in the living room, which was my bedroom. And when she came home, she watched the news every day, and so that's what I grew up doing. I watched the news. She got newspapers delivered to the house. I would read the newspaper every day when it arrived in the morning, and she would bring home the New York Times from work, and I would read that paper as well. I was just one of those kids who, had this appetite for news and current events, and really had no choice. Like I said, when she came home, she turned on the TV, and it was her domain. So I ended up watching the news with her, and just grew up doing that as a child, and didn't really think that it was having any impact on me until I got into college, and that's when it all kind of came together. And I had mentors in college and professors and people who talked to me about being a journalist, and they really connected those dots for me.
Right. Now, you went on to college, went up in the Northeast. Step us through that, because you went from there to going on and really concentrating in your graduate program around broadcasting.
Right. So born and raised in New York. We first lived in the Bronx, like I mentioned, moved to Queens, always went to New York City public high schools. When it came time to choose a college, my dad and my mom both took part in that by saying, my mother wanted me to get out of the city. My dad actually said to me, no HBCUs, because my dad is white, and he felt like I had pretty much lived a black experience, right?
Okay.
I grew up in the hood and grew up with most of my black family surrounding me, not really input from the white side of my family. And my dad said, look, you know how to be a black woman, but now I need you to learn how to kind of deal with a white world.
Right.
So ended up going to a very small liberal arts college called Bennington College in Vermont.
Right.
And I tell that story because it's relevant. I could have gone to Howard, I could have gone to Hampton, I could have, done a city college or something in New York, but they were adamant about me sort of having a different experience. So this was a small college campus in the mountains of Vermont, where I was one of the few black people and minorities on that campus instead of being the other way around, right? And in my New York City public high school, everyone looked like me. But here I was for the first time in my life in an area where everyone did not look like me. So it was learning how to maneuver in a different world, right? Which we all have to know now when you become an adult, right? So went to Bennington College and became a literature major there. Again, my first professor, my freshman year, said to me, you have a certain writing style that I like, that I think is good, and you should develop that writing. I didn't really make the connection what that meant, but he sort of talked to me about journalism. He was a former news writer for CBS News, so he knew what he was talking about, right? And of course, how would you end up having a professor who worked for CBS News? But he had worked with Dan Rather and others when he decided to take a break and become a teacher. So he was one of my first influences, and then I had internships during my time in college, and interned at Teachers College, which is on the campus of Columbia University, as a freshman, and met a couple there who would bring their children into the daycare center, and they were sort of a journalism couple. She was a former TV reporter who is now running a public relations business. He was a former reporter who was a script writer and sort of a public information person for the mayor of New York City at the time. So I meet these two people who talk to me about NABJ. I had never heard of NABJ before in my life, the National Association of Black Journalists. And they really talked to me about the importance of networking and mentors, and they became mentors to me. and kind of put me on that path. So throughout college, I, with their help, started looking for internships in the news business, which is not easy to do in New York City, right? The media capital of the world. But I learned that so many of those internships are taken early by, people whose parents work in those companies, right? Or people who go to colleges with relationships with those companies. My private little Bennington college didn't have those kind of media connections. So I had to learn to kind of carve my way. And fortunately, the Amsterdam News is in Harlem. And back when we had typewriters, I sent a letter, asked for an internship. The newsroom was probably smaller than your kitchen, right? And just a couple of old men sitting in there banging out stories on typewriters, and they said, "Sure, you want to intern for us? Come on up." And I did, and I would commute to Harlem every day from Queens. By this point, we were living in Queens, and I would do whatever they need me to go out, check on this, call on this, run out and get lunch. I mean, whatever it was that I needed to do, but I was learning how to be resourceful, and I was learning how to write a story. And I was also, being a native New Yorker, though, it was still giving me an opportunity to traverse the city. So I was still learning parts of the city and learning how to knock on doors and show up at offices and ask to speak to people. Because again, this is before we could just Google folks. You had to go physically look at them and see them and talk to them. You couldn't Skype an interview.
Right.
So that was a great experience. And then with the work that I did there, the clips, as they're called back then, I put together a resume and applied for an internship with the New York Times. And I'd like to say the rest is history, because I stayed at the New York Times after that internship. I was the only person who was from New York. All the other interns were from other cities. So I was able to stay when the internship was over and work in the newsroom. I got hired as a clerk in the newsroom and stayed there until it was time to go back to school. And then I kept the job. So when I had long weekends off, holidays, vacations, I came back to the New York Times and I worked there my sophomore, junior, and senior year. So that was a great experience. The editors and the reporters there became more mentors and friends to me, and I was able to talk to them, learn about what they do and how they do it. Got to go out on stories and check facts and do some digging for the New York Times. Wrote a couple of things that didn't have my name on it because that wasn't allowed, but was still able to build my resume at that point. And with the guidance of some of those same people at the Times, they talked to me about Columbia University and going to the graduate school. We call it the J School. And I decided that I'll try it. I mean, I'm here in New York. If I get in, that's great. And then I would do that before trying to really embark on getting a job as a reporter. And got into Columbia. So graduated Bennington, got into Columbia, and did it. And it was great. And continued to work at the New York Times. So I think I answered your question, but that's how I got, that's kind of how it all started. So
started, snowballed. You mastered the art of networking and cultivating those relationships, and then once in, kind of really making yourself invaluable to the point where they keep you on when others or go back to their schools. Give us a few nuggets on how you cultivated those relationships so that they would pay off for you.
I think I was fortunate in the fact that like I said, I was the New Yorker. All the other interns came in from other parts of the country, and they had a great experience. They all stayed together, and actually they stayed on the campus of Columbia University. I was coming from home every day. But I think because I was a New Yorker and I knew my way around the city fairly well, I was able to talk to the internship coordinator and others about what's next. What can I do? I like this place and I want to stay here. And if I can get a paycheck and do it, that's great too. And so I think being in those situations too. So, remember I said I didn't go the HBCU route or the city college route, but learning to sort of assert yourself when you are sort of the only person who looks like you. I could have easily been dismissed as, an intern and just get out the way. But I think, I learned how very early on not to be intimidated. I mean, these are serious editors and managers at the New York Times of all places, but I had to learn very quickly to assert myself and ask for what you want. There was only going to be one way to find out. I had to ask someone, and the worst they could do was say no. But you also bring up another good point too, because I would, in my downtime, walk around the New York Times building, which the original building on 43rd Street was huge, and many, many floors. And there were photographs all over the building from New York Times photographers who took pictures, and they were blown up and they were placed around the building. And I would walk around sometime just looking at the pictures. And one day, while I was a student at Columbia, literally bumped into a woman because I wasn't paying attention. She was getting off the elevator, I was getting on the elevator, and I think I was looking back at something and bumped into her. And once I bumped into her, when I looked at her, I said, oh my gosh. I knew she was a big deal because I was on a floor of the building where everyone was an executive. And she was a little perturbed that I think I stepped on her toe, but she kind of was like, who are you and why you're up here? Why are you up here? And I said, oh, I'm Jovita, I'm an intern. I'm a student. I was a grad student at the time. I told her I went to Columbia, and she said, come with me. I thought I was in trouble. She took me into her office and she said, sit down. And she had this beautiful office. Well, it turned out she was one of the, the head of the editorial board of the New York Times.
Wow.
And I'm sitting in this woman's office, first of all, thinking, okay, it's the end. I'm going to get kicked out of the building because I bumped into her.
And stepped on her toe.
And stepped on her toe. But instead, she was helpful. And she said, okay, what's your interest? What are you doing? You're wandering around the building. Certainly you have a natural curiosity for things. But she asked me, what are you here? And what's your goals? And so I told her that I was a J school student, working at the New York Times nights and weekends after class and on days that I didn't have class. And she said, so you're interested in television? And she, in that office, picked up the phone and called the person who was the president of the New York Times television group, which I had no idea that the New York Times even owned TV stations because I was so focused on working with the newspaper. And she put me in touch with him, and then he followed up by saying, send me your resume.
Wow.
And I got hired. That was my first job. So by the time I graduated Columbia, I had a job offer at their TV station in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which I actually had to look up in an encyclopedia at the time. I was familiar with Fayetteville, North Carolina. I had no idea where Arkansas was, let alone Fayetteville. And but that was sort of networking. That was being open, and that was having a conversation with someone instead of being intimidated and just kind of getting out of the way. I knew that I had to take that opportunity, and plus she called me into her office, but I couldn't wimp out, right? I was sitting there in front of her, and I better ask what I wanted or else.
Seize that moment.
Exactly.
What I also like about what you've laid out to us so far is that you also gave just as much importance to the Amsterdam News in terms of building skills and capabilities as the New York Times.
Right.
I myself had a similar situation. I worked for Wilmer Cullen Pickering on M Street in Washington, D.C., really high-end law firm, but then would come back to Alabama and work for a small law firm, one lawyer, prominent but small shop, and took it just as serious, learned just as much. And he needed me more because he was a one-man operation. But it gave me a lot more experience, and he himself put me in contact with a lot more connections, people, references, paid off really well. What did the Amsterdam News do in terms of helping to shape your skill set in your career?
I think, first of all, I approach the Amsterdam News with such respect because it is the oldest, black newspaper, and the fact that once that I was able to even get that opportunity, even though it was a cold call, there was no one asking on my behalf. It was me sending a letter and asking if I can come up there and work with them, and so I approached it with that respect and sort of that awe. So I think that's the first thing. I didn't go in there taking anything for granted. I knew that was a great opportunity, and it was a great opportunity to learn because it was bare bones. Like I said, just 2 or 3 men in there, and they're putting together a newspaper, and this newspaper that, again, was so important to so many people in the community in New York. And so just being in their midst, to me, was a great opportunity. And so I think I was more in awe of them, and I soaked up everything they said. And whether it was, when that red pen came out to circle what was wrong about the story that I had written. Okay, I understand, I got it, you know, and I had to take that criticism because all of it was learning, all of it was constructive. You know, even if I thought, wow, they're kind of mean, but it didn't matter what my feelings were. I knew that I had to learn from them while I could.
Right.
And again, I think I approached it with such respect that I was the sponge, and just let me soak up whatever I can from these men who are so hardworking and dedicated, you know, to this craft.
Right.
So
it sounds like that's one of the big keys to your success. You're a risk taker, and you're not afraid to hear the no. So you've heard a no. How did you? Is it the fact that you're looking to learn? You're not afraid of hearing the no?
Yeah.
How do you get past it?
I think you have to learn from it. When you do get a no, I mean, you can't sulk. I mean, you can't ball up, right, and start crying. You got to keep going. You have to still get to what you want to get to. And I think back then, you know, just being a student, and whether I was undergrad or graduate, I always felt like, well, if this doesn't work, something else will. You know, if this doesn't work out, okay, I'll just keep looking. Something else will come up. And even when I applied to Columbia, coming out of Bennington, and I applied to Columbia, my plan was, if I get into Columbia, great. I'm at home for another year. I can still work at the New York Times. I'm in New York City. And if I don't get into Columbia, well, I'll still work at the New York Times. That's not bad. And then maybe I'll apply to Northwestern next, you know. So I had a plan B if that first plan didn't work out. But I don't think, and you know, it's funny, when I think back to my younger self back then, I don't think it was ever a matter of being scared. I think it was a matter of being driven. And again, if I got a no, then just keep knocking on another door,
right.
You know. And there were plenty of times too, like I said, I had to do all of this with a typewriter, and you put a letter in an envelope and you mail it, right? There was no email. So I would mail out letters asking for internships and just wait. That's all you could do. And you were either going to get an acceptance or a decline letter, and then you had to keep going. And so I think I was eager enough and interested enough that the no's didn't deter me at that time, you know. But I think too, the other part of it is having those people who were willing to say yes. And when I realized that someone took the time to say yes and invited me into their office or their newsroom, whatever the case may be, then I guess I respected that so much that I also didn't want to disappoint them. So I wanted to make sure that I showed up and I performed and I did and I learned, you know, and I respected their positions because they did say yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you land in Arkansas, Fayetteville, Arkansas. I know when I came through school, everybody had dreams of first job being in New York or LA. How did that affect your psyche coming out of a great graduate program and going to Arkansas?
Right. I knew I had to get out of the city. You know, one thing that we teach people in this business, and one thing that was taught to me, you don't start in New York. New York is the #1 market for television. That's not where you start. And I knew that wherever I went, that was part of me building the foundation and having a solid foundation. My mentors always talked to me about stepping stones and paying your dues. Those are words we don't really hear these days. And we're working with a different generation who, they don't really get that. But the generation who came before me and the generation that taught me, especially in this business, they were all about paying dues, and it was all about crawling before you walk. And you don't just walk in the door and be the top dog. You got to crawl and get there and build up. So I knew that I could not start my career in New York City. I believed that was unrealistic, and I didn't think that that would happen. And so I set my sights on somewhere outside of New York. The only thing I wanted was, again, I thought I was going to Fayetteville, North Carolina. I figured at least it's still the East Coast, and I can hop on Amtrak if I need to. So it was completely different leaving New York City and landing in Fayetteville, Arkansas, home of the Razorbacks.
Right.
There was a small airport there,
yes.
Where, I mean, you flew in on maybe like a 20-seater plane, Tyson Foods, Walmart,
right.
And Bill Clinton was the governor
right.
at the time, and just announced that he was running for president probably 8 weeks after I landed there. So it was completely foreign to me. It was small country towns, you know, and I was out there by myself learning how to be a reporter. They call it a one-man band when you carry just like you today, right? You got your camera, you got your lights, you got your microphone, you're driving the truck, you're doing everything on your own. And it was an interesting experience, but I knew I had to do it in order to, that was my crawl. And in order to walk and then run, that's where I had to go.
Well, that's when I was doing a little research. They said that's where you excelled. You went out and got some of the best stories when you were the person doing everything.
It's a great place to learn, right? When you're, and I tell young people and interns, I tell them now, you know, you want to start small, and that's where you make your mistakes. That's where you learn, and that's when you figure things out. You know, starting in that small market in that small town. And again, I have to say, the man who was the news director at the time, and the guy who was my direct report, he was my producer. They were great role models, and they were great teachers, and they were also great mentors. They helped me every step of the way. I was the only black girl on TV when I got there in Arkansas, in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and it was a first time away from home, and could have been really scary, but I had their support at work, and that meant a lot to me. You know, I knew that they had my back. They didn't want me to fail. They didn't bring me out there to fail. And so I knew that, I had to learn from them, and I couldn't disappoint them, but I definitely couldn't disappoint myself. Yeah.
So you navigated that successfully because you ended up an anchor in that market. So talk to us about how you managed in that climate, because for people that are our age or a little older, we know that period was different in terms of being able to build corporate relationships, business relationships, especially for those that lead you to the very top position in the organization.
I think coming from my background, I have to say that having a degree from Bennington, having a degree from Columbia, coming from New York City, I think that all worked in my favor, right? And then I have to say that I probably had some talent that they saw. So someone along the way said, oh, she's good and she can do this, so let's push her. So when I got the opportunity to be an anchor, it was like I said before, I couldn't say no, and I had to speak up about what I wanted. I was at that TV station at a time where they decided to expand, and so that was great timing for me, and I think a lot of my career has been timing, but then again, having those mentors and just being ready to take opportunities. The news director at the time came to me and said that we're going to start a Saturday and Sunday morning show at 6 a.m. And at first I thought, oh my God, really? And then I said, yep, I'll do it. I wasn't not going to do it. I wasn't going to say no to that. That was an opportunity, and I had to take it. And again, it was, to me, it was, again, part of the climb. And it was what I had to do. And yeah, if I went to work at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, so be it. I had to learn how to do it. And I had to show them that I can do it. I felt like that was the only way that I was going to be able to move up and to move on, too, because that was also part of my objective. I got to Fayetteville, but I need to get out of Fayetteville, right? Because you want to be upward and onward. So I knew that there were bigger markets for me. I knew that Arkansas wasn't going to be home. It wasn't going to be my last step in my career, that I had to keep going. So if it meant getting up at 2, 3 in the morning on a Saturday and a Sunday, I had to do it.
So how did that transition work? How did you navigate that transition? Because I know with a lot of people in their careers who may get stuck at a certain spot, see a ceiling and not necessarily know how to work their way around that barrier. How did you do that? I mean, you had the support of an organization, obviously. I wouldn't want to have you leave if you're that good. How did you make that happen?
I think when it was time to go, I mean, we had that conversation. You know, I said I'm ready to move on, and had their blessing when it was time. I did that weekend morning show. I ended up moving to the weekend evenings after that. And then before I left Fayetteville, and technically it was Fort Smith now because that's where the main station is, So I had to move to Fort Smith in order to anchor. But so when I left that station, I was the 10 o'clock anchor Monday through Friday. And it was just, I took every opportunity that was presented to me. And I worked my butt off too, on the weekends, the weekend evenings, it was just myself and another young woman in the newsroom, and I had to roll the prompter, and it was so antiquated back then. The scripts were taped together and pretty much placed on a conveyor belt. If you tape the wrong script in the wrong order,
you're saying the wrong thing.
Yeah, right. So you are messed up. So it was her and I and the director in the booth, and we had to make it happen. And we did so successfully most weekends. Some days didn't go so well, but again, it was not turning down those opportunities and just doing the best I could. And when it came time to move on after 3 years, I said, I'm ready to go.
Right.
So, and I was very open about looking for the next job.
Right.
So, yep.
Now, I've heard you say mentors, plural, several times. How many do you have, and do they coach you on different aspects of your career?
I think as I've gotten older and more experienced in the business, of course, the mentor pool has shrunk a little bit, right? Some of the people I'm referring to, they're no longer in the business. Some of them I'm still friends with. I still have their cell phones, and I call them up, and we're on Facebook, and I know their children. So today, my mentors are certainly a smaller group, but they are people who I've known over the years in this business, and some of them are out of this business. They don't work in television, but they're able to give me sage advice. And because they're out of it, they can have more of an objective, I think, perspective sometimes, and just talk about that process of navigating something regardless of what industry you're in. So it's hard to say that a number. If I had to put a number, I don't know, you could say 5, but I don't know, maybe there are like 8 people who I trust enough to talk to and have conversations with, even after all these years in the business. And my first job was 1990, so this is 2019, so that's 29 years of doing this. But again, there are a few people who I keep in touch with.
Excellent.
Yep.
Work-life balance. You're one of the most successful people in Atlanta. We see you everywhere. How do you maintain a work-life balance?
Yeah, I don't know. Every year for the longest, and I think I didn't do it this year. For the longest, my New Year's resolution was to learn how to say no. And sometimes I even write it down. I'm glad
you didn't say that to me, by the way.
Right. I write it down, but it still doesn't happen for some reason. So I think that I'm always doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? But work-life balance is not easy. It's not easy in this business. I know on the outside it looks very glamorous, and you're on TV, and oh my goodness, and you meet all these people, but it's hard work. I mean, most people are at home having dinner, and where am I? Right here in the office. Exactly, in the office, in the newsroom, and that's hard. A lot of people don't realize those sort of sacrifices. Sure, I chose to do it. I get that. I chose to be here, but at the same time, it is a sacrifice when you're not. We don't have dinner at 6 o'clock. We have dinner more like 8 o'clock on those nights that I can go home. When you're working your way up and working nights and weekends and mornings, that's tough to balance a family. I used to say that it takes a village to raise my children, because I felt like I was that mom who had to have all the neighbors' phone numbers, and I even needed the husband's phone numbers, because if I can't reach you, I might need to reach your husband. Somebody go get my kids, or whatever the case may be. And so it's not an easy thing, and you have to have that support network around you. My mom moved here shortly after we got to Atlanta, and after the kids came, she moved here to help. But then I've always had a nanny and a babysitter and a backup babysitter. And you always have these people. Those stay-at-home moms are wonders. You always need a stay-at-home mom in your life, because she may be a little bit more flexible at that moment than you are. So those are the people who I've learned over the years that I have to have that support network, because you can't do it all by yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Last question. What would you say to young people that are coming up now? The top 3 things that they can do to build a successful career? Because it sounds like at every step along the way you've had a goal, an objective, a plan. what are the 3 things you would advise them to do in building the kind of career path or success that you've achieved?
I think one of the first things, and especially where I see a deficit these days, is you have to be a student of that industry, whatever that industry is, right? If it's news, I'm disappointed sometimes by the young people who come here to the newsroom and they don't watch a newscast, or they're in college but they don't have a television, or they don't watch TV on a regular basis, and I mean specifically the news. Well, how can you be a news person if you're not watching the news? So I think you have to be, but the same thing, how can you be a doctor if you're not paying attention to what's happening in medicine or with insurance companies or whatever the case may be? So whatever it is, if you want to be a lawyer, you should know legal matters, you should know cases, you should know what the Supreme Court is working on. Right, whatever it is. So be a student of that industry and know what you're talking about or know what you're getting into. The other thing is, I can't say it enough, you got to find mentors. You have to have people in that business, whatever it is, whom you can talk to, bounce ideas off of, learn from, get advice, harass slightly when you need to, and you have to nurture those relationships. I'm often disappointed when I spend time with a young person and either never hear from them again or don't even get a thank you note. And that's something, again, my generation, the people who taught me,
handwritten thank you note.
You'd be dead.
Anytime
You'd be done. You'd be done if you didn't do that. And that's a lost art. And they're not being told. And so I see that changing. And then the other thing is internships. So whatever it is, again, whatever industry it is, someone mentioned to me the other day that his daughter is a rising high school senior, but she was like interning at the district attorney's office because she wants to go to law school. You've got to do it. You've got to get in there, and you got to be tenacious about it. And maybe they don't accept you on the first go around, try the second go around. Maybe they say, well, we don't accept high school juniors, but maybe they'll take high school seniors. Whatever the case may be, and especially as a college student, you can't want to be a television reporter or a newspaper reporter and by your junior year not have had an internship. You need to start those internships as soon as possible. So right after your freshman year, or starting your sophomore year, and in your sophomore year, you've got to get in there. I think a lot of my path has almost been a process of elimination. I learned what I didn't want to do, so those are the things I avoided. And the only way I learned when I was at the New York Times, I learned I didn't want to be a newspaper reporter. I saw the difference between sitting at the news desk and the same story I had been working on all day was now the lead story on the local TV station at 6 o'clock. Well, you weren't going to see my story until the next morning. And to me, at that time, again, we're talking late 80s, I was devastated by that, and I would get frustrated. I was like, you mean I've been at the police department all day, and there they are, same information, but you're not going to read my information until tomorrow. So that taught me that I didn't want to do that, so I had to focus on what I did want to do, and that was television. So you've got to have those internships to show you. A lot of people, too, have come through here over the years, college students. They're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and then after a couple of weeks, they're like, oh, yeah, no. I don't want to do it. Or whatever it is. Something has changed their mind and they see, oh, maybe it's not as easy as I thought. It's not as glamorous as I thought. Wow, we got to stand outside in 90-degree weather one more day. I don't want to do this. Whatever the case may be, but then you figure it out and then you move on. And then you do what you do want to do.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. I often coach young people to seek internships to learn and not to earn. If you take that approach, you're going to get a lot more out of it than just the money. And you're absolutely right. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And so many nuggets. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, wait, I better try that and try that myself, because it's never too late to apply any of the things that you've just said. So thank you so much for sharing this with our audience and sharing your story and giving